And I think the secret is that he understood that the Lord was sovereign through his entire life. Right? Joseph went through a lot. For those who don't know, just quick recap. His older brothers, he had 11 older brothers. His father loved Joseph, probably the most, right? It was kind of obvious. He gave Joseph a new robe that was rainbow color. Back then, I would assume it's very difficult to get multicolored clothes. But his brothers sold him into slavery. Right? You would think slavery is something already so horrific and barbaric today. You would think back in those days, even more so. And so for him to have to go through that and to go through even more suffering by being accused of wrongdoing, of assault, and being thrown into jail of the chief of, I think, is like Pharaoh's chief of staff. Right? He had to suffer through that, and then yet he overcame everything. In prison, when he was put in prison, he overcame to be essentially the head of the prison, even though he was a prisoner. That's how much trust those in charge put in him. But again, Joseph was able to overcome because he had this foundation of the Lord in his vision. Right? He knew that all this was the Lord's doing for his own good. Right? And to sum it up, at the end of the story, Joseph was then able to forgive his brothers, right? Shake their conscience, bring them into this life of submission to the Lord. And when Joseph's father died, the brothers were afraid that Joseph was now going to take his revenge. But Joseph goes, "As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good." Right? And that was kind of like the summary statement of Joseph's true understanding of the Lord in his life. Right? Everything you do against me, it's not really you, it's the Lord. And we saw the same attitude in Jesus Christ when even Pilate was questioning him. Like, it is Jesus that gave up his own life, and it is not taken from him. So again, there's something much grander than Joseph that he kept his eye on. And that obviously was the Lord himself. And that's what was made him able to overcome a lot of suffering in his life, a lot of tribulation. So with that in mind, I'd like to share in short form, quickly from Philippians 2, which is where we're going to be reading this week in our devotionals. So what I like to do usually whenever I share is to share from the chapter that we're covering. So again, Philippians 2. It was extremely difficult to prepare something because there's just so much in this chapter alone, not even concerning the entire book. So excuse me, pardon me if I kind of go in different directions. There's just so much here that I had really hard time culling down. But the verse I'm going to focus on today is Philippians 2:4. Let each of you look not only to his own interests, but also to the interest of others. Right, so the purpose in introducing Joseph was that he was able to look beyond himself and to consider the Lord's work, essentially his brothers, before his own natural desires. For instance, to get revenge, something that he could have done so easily given his power given to him at the time. But again, this verse calls us to live a different way than what the world, what we naturally would want to live. Let each of you look not only to his own interests, but also to the interests of others. And you see, this was actually Jesus' command as well. Right? In John, Jesus gave his followers a new command. As I've loved you, so you must love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another. I bring this up because we are growing in numbers slowly today, kind of artificially so. But we're also going to be moving into a new place. And the amount of responsibilities that we are listing out is huge. Like, you wouldn't think so. I think graciously, Julia and Dana covered a lot of the responsibilities, a lot of the things that were taken care of when we met at their apartment. But we met maybe a month ago, the elders, to discuss a new place and kind of what are the things that we have to consider. The list is very long. It's just so many things we haven't thought about before. And so I wanted to bring it back again to this issue of serving one another not just kind of one-on-one basis, but also considering the body and how we serve the body. Because again, there's going to be so much that's required in order for us to simply meet every week. And so I want to encourage everybody to look, actively seek out what are these things that, the Lord's calling me to help in, which we all are called to do, right? So I said before that this is a commandment, right? And so the commandment is that we serve one another in whatever fashion the Lord has called us to. Romans 12:13 says, contribute to the needs of the saints and seek to show hospitality. 1 Peter 4:10, as each has received a gift, use it to serve one another as good stewards of God's varied grace. And look, again, very simple message. I want to encourage everyone to think about these things, right? I'm not going to list them out, but there's so many things that we could do. Not just in terms of like the spiritual matters, like being prepared to come and share on brother's table, the table and opening time, to come and share something, during the offering table. Now, all these things alongside with all the physical responsibilities, all that stuff I feel like is obvious to us. We just need to seek it out and we'll find it. But what I hope to convey is that we can't be only receivers anymore, right? We can't move forward if majority of us are just receivers where we come and we just receive. It's time to start giving and time to start even doing. Now, this is kind of a sticky subject because then you're like, okay, so are we talking about works versus salvation? No. A Christian life in the body is characterized uniquely in that all the saints look out for the interests of others. And we've been studying life together. And this past Monday, we studied the chapter called Ministry. And in it, I encourage you guys to read it if you haven't. I did buy about 50 copies, but I think weekly attendance is about 10. So hopefully you guys are following along in your own times. And it's really, really deep book. And I think I mentioned this during the meeting that as an offshoot, it's a very sober read. It's a very serious, sober read. But as soon as you read it, there's this kind of like something that wells up within, at least with me, something so serious that can call like a deep joy or a deep kind of passion to be aroused. So I really encourage you to read it, especially in this past chapter, ministry. There's a few specific things: ministry of helpfulness, ministry of listening, and ministry of meekness. I feel like those three really capture the essence of what it means to really serve one another in the body. And so, especially ministry of helpfulness, I'll just stay on this a little bit more. It talks about, I was really convicted about it. It talks about being inconvenienced for your time. I think it's something we struggle with, all of us. But are you submissive enough to the Lord to be inconvenienced for your time to help do simple matters, simple physical matters, as Dietrich Bonhoeffer was saying? So again, today I hope we all take a step back to examine our lives and how we are contributing to the body here. Are we being hospitable to one another? Are we looking out for one another? Again, this is a commandment of the Lord. And if commandments aren't being obeyed, then there's sure to be discipline involved as well. So with that kind of out of the way, let's turn to Matthew 7:22-23. On that day, many will say to me, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name and cast out demons in your name and do many mighty works in your name? And then I will declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you workers of lawlessness. Let's read 24-27 as well. Everyone then who hears these words of mine and does them will be like a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain fell and the floods came and the winds blew and beat on that house, but it did not fall, because it had been founded on the rock. And everyone who hears these words of mine and does not do them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. And the rain fell and the floods came and the winds blew and beat against that house. And it fell, and great was the fall of it. Very difficult statement to read there in 22 and 23, especially 23. Then I will declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you workers of evil. So So as we know from James, the book of James, he talks about this as well, right? Faith without works is dead, but work without faith also is dead as well. And what I wanted to bring this about was really for those of us who are active in serving, and or even for us when we begin to serve and really give forward, an effort to love one another in way of service and looking for things of the meeting place, really. Consider these words that Jesus said, right? So I'm going to break it down here by just that verse alone again, verse 22. On that day, many will say, Lord. So this word Lord used here, I think in the Greek, it was kurios. And it meant, that word kurios is only used for God, right? So the fact that these people go to Jesus and call him God proves that they knew their stuff, right? These people knew their theology. They had that right. They had it down pat. Secondly, Lord, Lord. They didn't even just call him Lord. Lord, Lord would indicate kind of a deeper emotion attached to the Lord that they had. Right? There was passion in it. Whenever someone's name was doubly invoked, it would invoke more passion and more of a emotionally involved statement that they were about to follow up with. And finally, they were active in service, right? These people were, they prophesied, they casted out demons, and they did many mighty works in their name. Right? They did all these good things, and Jesus did not deny that at all. But again, Jesus did say that on the last day he would say to them, I never knew you. Very scary. I feel like if this doesn't kind of give us pause here, should worry us, right? A lot of times we will judge the way we kind of perform with amongst one another and for the body as a gauge of how we're doing spiritually. But again, this is not the case here. What was Jesus aiming for? Really, what is Jesus aiming for if in the New Testament I said the commandment was really to serve and love one another. It seems like these people here are serving and loving the Lord. But let's go back one verse to verse 21. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. Right, so the absence of kind of these traits that I just talked about, being, theologically right, being active in ministry, and having this deep emotional connection with the Lord, it's not a kind of a guarantee that you are a Christian, as Jesus is saying. However, the presence of these traits is also the lack of these traits definitely is not Christian-like, right? There's no, the absence of these traits demonstrates certainly that you are not a Christian. So what is the Lord looking for? He's saying there in 21, he's looking for those who do the will of the Father. So what does this really mean? I think it's best explained by the parable that follows there of those who build their house on the rock versus those that build their house on the sand. Everyone then who hears these words of mine and does them will be like a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain fell and the floods came and the winds blew and beat on that house. But it did not fall because it had been founded on the rock. And everyone who hears these words of mine and does not do them will be like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain fell, floods came, winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell, and great was the fall of it. Right? So what were these people saying that came to Jesus? They were coming to Jesus, and how were they claiming to be before him? We served you. I'm calling you by Jesus. I'm calling you by God. We served you. Hello, shouldn't I be in heaven? Right? And that was the sand upon which they built their house. Everything that they built their house upon was themselves. Right? And we know the obvious thing here is that we need to build upon the rock that is Jesus Christ. But I think it goes deeper than that by what Jesus is saying. Like, he who does the will of my Father, this is person, he's going to enter into heaven. Full submission to the will of the Father is what he is looking for. I think the best example of this is looking at when I think it's 1 Kings or Samuel 15, when Saul was commanded by God to battle the Amalekites after victory was given to him. What was he supposed to do? Destroy all the cattle and sheep, everything, cattle and sheep included. But Saul kept it. And when Samuel asked him, he's like, what are you doing, dummy? Saul goes, oh, this is for the sacrifice of the temple. I believe, this is a good thing. You have hundreds of thousands of cattle that we're going to sacrifice unto the Lord. Very valuable. You would think it's a good thing. But the Lord rejected it, right? The Lord absolutely rejected it because he didn't want the sheep. He doesn't want your cattle. He wants you. And if your submission to him is not in full, but is only in part, and you're depending on the things you can do externally, it's false, because anyone can do these external things, right? You have two sets of people here again in verses 22 and 23. You can't tell the difference on the outside. You can't tell the difference. But it's those who are fully submitted to the will of God will enter in the kingdom. So kind of like the route to obedience of the commandment to love and to serve, what I was going upon earlier in Philippians 2, right? It's dependent on your relationship with the Lord, right? We can serve until we are, we have nothing left, but it's all built upon sand if our relationship with the Lord is null, right? It's not going to produce fruit that survives through eternity. And so I think the reality check for us, all of us here, as old as we are, is really this: like, do you know the Lord as your true master? And this is what brings us back to Joseph too, right? Even though it seemed like his house that was being built kept on being dropped over and over again, right? Regardless, his foundation was set, and that's why he was able to overcome and enter into this like ruling and reigning that he was called to do, and that we're all called to do, to overcome these daily things that we struggle against, right? There is something so far beyond the daily things that the Lord is calling us to. An outflow of that, of course, is serving one another beyond our means. But again, that's all dependent on how well you know your master. And, I don't mean to call into question the fruits that we're bearing. I don't mean to call into question your salvation at all. But I think we need to understand how we submit to the Lord. When we're reading Life Together, the second chapter was the day alone with him. I think it really outlines a way of life that shows your submission to the Lord, and that your day begins with him and your night ends with him. Of course, I'm preaching to myself too. But your full day, does it really belong to the Lord? Are you asking the Lord for what's next in your life? How do I serve the body? Or is it more just all reactionary, right? Is it all like, I should do this because X, Y, Z? That's not the way the Lord wants our heart. He wants it in full, in such a way that, sometimes what he'll call us to do is doesn't make sense. I think a lot of times it doesn't make sense. But are we ready to accept that and to move forward with that? Again, don't mean to sound so dour in here, but us being here alone is, all of us here are called here for a reason, to listen to this, whatever this sharing is called, is seeming. But the Lord had brought you here for a specific reason. If you believe the Lord is in sovereign control of everything of this world, then you being here amongst saints, partaking in the bread and the cup, means something, right? It means something that you are here, that you put yourself here before the Lord. And I'll just end with this. I read this from a book as I was preparing for the sermon. So there are these two. Let's say I got this book again from a book by D.A. Carson. Mr. Smith and Mr. Joe. Very Hebrew names, right? back they were living in Egypt as slaves. Mr. Joe goes to Mr. Smith. Did you put blood on your doorposts and on the lintels as we were commanded to do? Mr. Smith goes, yeah, of course. Mr. Joe then goes, okay, I was just wondering because it just seems kind of weird. But it seems like with all that's going on, Moses saying we had to do this or else we would face dire consequences. And with all the frogs and all these things going on, I'm still uncertain that something so ridiculous would be able to save us from whatever's next. But Mr. Smith goes, Mr. Joe, but this is what we were told to do. We just, sacrifice the lamb and paint the blood on its doorposts and lintels. That's what we're called to do. And Mr. Joe said, I'm still uncertain, kind of wavering. Later that night, and the next day, do you think either of Mr. Joe or Mr. Smith's firstborn was dead, had died? Neither of theirs, right? Right. So it's, what I wanted to end with this because I wanted that assurance of deliverance is not bound to our temporal feelings of faith and what we have in the Lord, right? Or even in our consistency or purity of our faith, but really is bound to the objective truth that in what we celebrated earlier today, the bread and the cup around the table, Jesus Christ dying for us, right? Again, our assurance of entering into this kingdom is not on what we do, but again, what we do shows if this faith is real, right? And so, again, I hope with a short message, you take away these two things. Examine your life, whether you and what you do are fully submissive to the Lord, regardless of the things you want in your life, regardless of what the world is telling you. We're pulled in so many directions, but are you willing to forego things of this world, things for yourself, in order to submit to the Lord and to his things, whether it be job, popularity, friends, all these things? Are you willing to forego any of that by being submissive to the Lord, right? A lot of his commands are not easy. But again, that's what he wants of you. He'll reject everything else if he doesn't have you in your heart, right? And so secondly, once you're confirmed of that, right, we have to enter into this new life in which he's called us to rule and reign, even in this world, in this time, in order that we may be prepared for eternity's time, right? So those two things, I pray that, today as we leave today, you may dwell on these things. One, that, Philippians 2:4, that we seek the interest of others, before ourselves. And secondly, really consider the words of Jesus in that he desires those who follow the will of the Father, right? And so hopefully that the Lord speaks through that, and we'll close there. Lord, we thank you again for this time, for the assurance that we are constantly being fed about the finality of our forgiveness on the cross. And yet we don't want to take that lightly. Lord, we want our lives to reflect that all the time. And so show us what that means and show us how we submit to you so that we can fully enter in with this body here, that we may serve with one another, that we may bear with one another, love one another in full as you will have us do. We know that all this is done because you love us and desire for us to enter into this, transcend, into this next plane above what the world has to offer here. And so give us that heavenly vision, allow us to see further than what we're able to see. And that is what is in your heart. In Jesus' name we pray.